Good morning. I want to invite you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 2 again this morning, please. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. We're going to read beginning in verse 9 of that context. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 9. The last couple weeks, we've talked from these opening chapters of 1 Corinthians about the things that unite us. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the word of the cross and how Paul really emphasized that as the beginning place for our unity as believers. It's the cross of Christ that is responsible for our reconciliation with God. It's the cross of Christ that's responsible for our reconciliation with one another. It's the cross of Christ that teaches us about how we ought to walk. It is the model for how I behave toward my brothers and sisters. It's the model for how I behave toward God. We talked last week, we repeated that, and if you'd like to go back and listen to that, that was from 2 weeks ago that we talked about the word of the cross. We talked about it a little bit more last week, just in terms of review. But we talked about two other principles that Paul talks about that unite us as believers in these first couple chapters of 1 Corinthians. We talked about how the power of God is another thing. Trusting in the power of God is another thing that unites us. We believe that God is involved in us and God is involved in our world. And so that gives us a measure of confidence in our walk together that we believe that God is reigning, that God is actively reigning and is involved in human affairs. The third thing that we talked about, counting the word of the cross, the trusting in the power of God, the third thing that we talked about was about how the wisdom of God is something that unites us. And Paul emphasizes that in the second chapter of 1 Corinthians, that we rely entirely, not on our wisdom, not on our innovation, not on our ability to figure things out, not on our ideas about how to approach God, but we are united by our trust in the fact that God has revealed His wisdom to us through the Spirit. And it is that we have received His mind. He has spoken to us so that we know what to do, so that we know what to think, so that we know how to approach Him. And so it is that mind of God revealed to us that is another dimension of what unites us together. Next week, I'm going to move on to what Paul says, particularly in chapters 3 and 4 of Corinthians, when he talks about how we're united by our stewardship, by the obligation that we have to God together, by the stewardship that He's given us, and the accountability for that stewardship. But today I want to explore a little bit more about the matter of us being united by the wisdom of God. And so I want to read together the latter half of 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And if you'll begin reading with me in verse 9 of chapter 2, and we're going to read through the end of the chapter. Paul writes, "But just as it is written, things which eye has not seen, and ear has not heard, and which have not entered the heart of man, all that God has prepared for those who love Him." So just get this before we move on. He's quoting from Isaiah, and Isaiah had said that God had things that He was preparing for those who loved Him, which man would never have seen did God not show it to him. And man never would have heard these things if God had not spoken these things to him. And man never would have imagined what God was going to do without God revealing these things to the heart of man. So he's humbling us to recognize that we can't see, we can't hear, we don't know what to think unless God speaks to us. But God has spoken. And God has spoken things that our eyes never saw, and that our ears never heard, and that our heart never imagined. God has spoken those things to us. How's He done so? Well, He tells us beginning in verse 10. He said, how do we know these things? He says, we know these things because God revealed them through the Spirit. And so God's Holy Spirit communicated these things to His apostles, to His prophets, first through His Son, and then through His Son's apostles and prophets, so that we could know the things that God wanted us to see, that God wanted us to hear, that God wanted our hearts to be full of when we love Him. He says, for who among men, verse 11, for who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? So he's showing us the necessity of why these things have to be shown to us, why we couldn't attain these things on our own. Because he said, who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? If I could paraphrase, he's saying, I can't read your mind, and you can't read my mind. And if I can't read your mind, and if you can't read my mind, then none of us can read God's mind. The only way to know what God is thinking, what God is purposing, why God is acting, why He's doing and saying the things that He says and does, is if God tells us. We can't read His heart, we can't read His mind, just like we are unable to do so with each other. So he says, even so the thoughts of God no one knows except the Spirit of God, verse 11. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God. There's good news. God has sent His Spirit so that we can know what He thinks. We can know what He's doing. He says, we've not received, as believers, we've not received the spirit of the world, but we've received the Spirit who is from God, that we might know the things freely given to us by God. So we can know these things with a certainty. Verse 13, which things we also speak, not in words taught by human wisdom. That is not only the ideas didn't originate with us, but even the words used to communicate the ideas and the thoughts and the feelings and the purposes of God, they didn't originate with man. So as Paul is writing the things that he's writing here in 1 Corinthians, or if we were to read any other letter in the New Testament, or if we had been a part of a live audience where Paul or one of the other apostles or one of the prophets were speaking, the words that they were speaking were not words that originated with them, they were words that originated with God. And so God not only planted or seeded the ideas in their heads, God also gave them the words to speak. He says, verse 13 again, which things we also speak, not in words taught by human wisdom, but he said their schoolmaster or their teacher was the Spirit, and those words taught by the Spirit, combining spiritual thoughts with spiritual words. Verse 14, but a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually appraised. That is, if you are not a person that's inclined to listen to God, then the things that God says are going to look foolish to you. The things that God has purposed are going to look ridiculous. They're not going to be something that you accept. And so there needs to be a heart of humility that comes to God and says, teach me, God. Speak to me, because I don't know. And so he says the things, he says the natural man won't accept the things of the Spirit of God. Verse 15, but he who is spiritual appraises all things, yet he himself is appraised by no man. For who has known the mind of the Lord that he should instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. None of us can teach God anything. None of us can. God didn't learn anything from us. Everything that is real wisdom is wisdom that we learn from God. And even though we can't know what God thinks and what God is purposing unless God has spoken to us, here is the thing that is so marvelous. God has spoken to us. He has sent His Spirit. He has communicated to us. And things which we could never see, which we could never hear, which we could never imagine on our own, we can see and we can hear and we can imagine, so that we know the mind of God. We know the mind of Christ, because God has revealed His mind to us. Now I want to speak in terms of the application of what it is that Paul is saying to us here about how we're united by the wisdom of God. I want to state it this way. We are united by the wisdom that God has spoken. We are united by the wisdom that God has spoken. The reason I'm emphasizing the fact that we are united by the wisdom that God has spoken is that is the only wisdom that if God hasn't said it, we can't be united by it. Does that make sense? The only thing that can unite us is the wisdom that God has revealed. There may be wise things that God has not said to us, but I don't know what those things are if He hasn't said them. Unless God has communicated that wisdom, then I don't know. I don't know. I can't say with confidence anything that God hasn't spoken. And so the thing that unites us or that yokes us together as believers is the wisdom that God has spoken. We are united by that. If God has not spoken, then I want you to look back at what he says in verse 9. If God has not spoken, then we are left to our own ability to see. And we are left to our own ability to hear something. And we are left to our own ability to imagine things. If God has not spoken, we are left to our own imaginations, to our own ideas, to our own preferences about God and about what God wills. And those possibilities are endless, aren't they? I mean, there are thousands of things that you and I can imagine that we'd like to do for God. There are thousands of ideas that we might have about God, about what God wants, about what God looks like, about what God's purposes are. But when I try to speak about any of those things, then I'm speculating, because I don't know that unless God's told me. And so the possibilities are endless in an area where God has not spoken. And what that means, if the possibilities are endless, then our togetherness and our unity about those things that God has not said anything about becomes impossible. Does that make sense? Let me see if I can illustrate that a few different ways. We can't, again, going back to chapter 2 and verse 11, we can't read one another's mind. So we can't read God's mind. I don't know what God thinks unless God tells me what He thinks. But the matter of God being silent, making sense of what God has not said, or guessing what God thinks when God has not spoken, interpreting God's silence is something that's an impossibility. But it's not just an impossibility when God is silent. All silence is impossible to interpret. And I know that sounds a bit academic, but so let me break that down. All silence, I want to suggest to you, is uninterpretable. It's impossible for me to assign meaning to silence. Not because silence means nothing, but because silence can mean so many things. Here's an illustration. Have you ever received or have you ever given to someone else the silent treatment? Yeah, and so when someone is being quiet, then what do? You start trying to figure out what their silence means. Why are they being quiet? Did I say something wrong? Did I do something wrong? Did I say too much? Did I say too little? Did I forget to notice her outfit? Did I forget to notice her haircut? Did I not notice? Did I not compliment the supper? You know, what is it? What is it that I didn't do, or what is it that I did do? And the reason why we start to ask questions is because we don't know what the silence means. Now you should know what the silence mean, right? I mean that's the way. But that's what makes the silent treatment manipulative behavior, is that we don't know the meaning of it until someone talks. And the only way that there's going to be a reconciliation, the only way there's going to be a meeting of minds with regard to that silence, is if the silence is broken and we start talking. We have to talk to each other. That's the only way that we know what one another thinks and what's on one another's heart. Think about a situation where the kids are in another room, they're in a bedroom and you're in the living room, and all of a sudden there had been noise and all of a sudden it gets quiet. Okay, what does the silence mean? Something bad. It means something. Now, it might not mean something bad. But that's a good guess. But it might not mean. But see, it's not that the silence means nothing. It's that the silence can mean so many things. There are endless possibilities of what might be going on. The kids might have run away. They might have broken something, and now they're trying to glue it back together. There might have been a fuss or a fight, and now the big brother's saying, "Shh, don't cry." You know, they might be asleep. They might be into something that they shouldn't be into. They might be coloring on the walls. I mean, the thing is you don't know what the silence means, and so what do? You go check it out, right? You go see what's going on, because that's the only way to know for sure. You can't guess what the silence means. You've got to have more information. We use certain terms when we speak of silence that are indicative of the fact that this is common sense. We use this all the time. Sometimes we speak of silence as deafening. Now that's contradictory. How can silence be deafening? Well, the reason why we can speak of a deafening silence when we're outside and it's dark and we're all alone is because the silence can mean so many things. Is somebody out there? Is something out there? Is something bad about, because it's not normal for things to be so quiet. But we don't know what the quiet means. Is there going to be a tornado? Is there going to be a hurricane? What does the silence mean? I don't know. And so that's why we call the silence deafening, because the silence can mean so many things. We also speak of a pregnant pause. It might be in a performance, or it might be when a speaker is talking and all of a sudden he stops. What does it mean? Well, it's pregnant with possibilities. It can mean so many things. We don't know what's about to happen next in the play or in the performance. We don't know what the speaker is about to say next. And that's the whole point of the pause, is that the pause makes the listener, the pause makes the spectator curious. And so it starts, all these possibilities start running through their mind. What's going to happen next? What's he going to say? And that curiosity or that anticipation gets the listener. It causes them to lean forward. It causes them to listen a bit more attentively to what is said next. Because it can mean so many things, and we're eager to know, why are they silent? What are they about to say? And so I say again that it's not just God's silence that is uninterpretable. Silence, period, is uninterpretable. If you can't turn the car on, you don't know what that means. So many things could be broken that would keep it from turning over. And so you've got to start figuring out what the possibilities are. So what if we fill in the blanks every time we experience silence? What are the chances of getting it right? I want to say to you, they're not very good. Have you had the experience of someone finishing your sentence for you? Or when you finish someone else, they start to say something, you start to say something and someone finishes your sentence, or you finish their sentence for you. Occasionally you might get it right. And if it's a story that you've heard someone tell before, you might know what they're about to say next. But a lot of times we get it wrong. And even if you get it right, how does someone else feel when you finish their sentence for them? I mean, usually it's irritating when someone finishes your sentence for you, because there is an arrogance in presuming to know what someone is going to say when they haven't finished saying what they plan to say. And so when I act like I know what they're going to say so that I finish their sentence for them, there is a pride in that, there is an arrogance in that, there's a presumption that's a part of that. Now get this. If it is rude for me to finish your sentences for you and for you to finish my sentences for me, then how rude is it for me to finish God's sentences for Him? To fill in the blanks when God has not spoken. There is an arrogance and a presumption that's a part of that. Have you ever clapped or seen people clap at a performance when the performance paused and it was the wrong place to clap? It wasn't because the performer was finished. It's because it was a dramatic pause. I remember in 5th grade when Mrs. Bernard was going to take our class to go see the Nutcracker. And she told us before we went, look, when they stop, don't clap. You wait for me to know when to clap, because I know when you're supposed to clap. I mean, she was coaching us in terms of not misinterpreting what silence means. It's rude to clap when the performer's not done. And so we've got to be careful about misinterpreting silence or presuming that we know what it means. If you ignore the quietness of your children in the other room, you will live to regret it. Right? If you ignore the silence of the children in the other room, you'll live to regret it. Because you can't assume by their silence that everything is okay. You need to go and check it out. It just underlines the point again that I can't know what silence means without more information. Someone has to speak, or I have to go check it out in order to make sense of it. Here's the application of that then. If I can't assign meaning to the silence of other people, then I can't assign meaning to God's silence. The only way to know what God thinks about anything is for God to speak to me. And if it's arrogant and disrespectful for me to speak and finish other people's sentences for them, then it is arrogant and it is disrespectful for me to speak when God has not spoken. I am not equipped to fill in God's blanks for Him. I am not equipped to finish God's sentences for Him. And so I have to assume that when God has not spoken, or when God stops speaking, it's because God has finished talking. Or that's all He has to say about it, until He breaks the silence and says something more. I can't speak in the wake of God's silence. And so that means that when it comes to us being united together as a people, we must listen to and share what God has spoken to us, and only what God has spoken to us. And we must be content and we must be quiet when God has not spoken. We can't go beyond what He's written. We can't go beyond what He said. And if we intrude into those areas where God has not spoken, then the possibilities of where we'll arrive in intruding into God's silence are endless. Because we all have ideas, we all have preferences, we all have things we'd like to do, we all have things that we think that God might approve of, but none of those things we can speak about with any certainty. And it will be impossible for us to be unified on those things, because all of those are areas about which God has not spoken. So let me give you some practical examples of that. Think about just the origin of the world. Where'd the world come from? If we remove God's Word from that, and we just depend on our ability to figure things out, and our imagination, how endless are the possibilities? I mean, your idea of how it all started is just as good as anyone else's. And you might point to something in science. You might observe some patterns in the natural world. But if God doesn't tell us the way that He's told us, then the possibilities are endless about how it all started. What about the origin of man? Where do we come from? And here's a bigger question: why are we here? You take away what God has spoken about that, and the possibilities are endless. And in fact, the religions and the philosophies that you find throughout the world are all attempts to answer those questions about how it all began and where do we come from and why are we here. And just as diverse as all those religions are and all those philosophies are, I mean, the possibilities are endless. There's all kinds of notions about that. But the beauty is that God has spoken, and He has told us, He has informed us about where the world came from and about how we got here, who we are, that we are made in the likeness of God, that we're created in His image, that there are things, bad things that happen in this world, and it's our fault because we sinned against God. And so it explains the origin of evil, and it explains the purpose of why we're here, that God wants a relationship with us, and that He's actively pursuing that by redeeming us from this evil that's in the world, so that we as sinners even can have a relationship with Him. I would never guess that if God didn't speak. Because I can't make sense of God not speaking. I can't guess what God is doing on my own. God has to tell me. What is God like? What is God like? In the absence of God telling me what He's like, speaking to me in His Word, man has the idea that there are many gods, and that those gods are in competition with each other, and that those gods look and act like us. They have the same kind of selfish motivations. They manipulate. They get angry. They do unjust things. They are arrogant and want our worship. I mean, those are all the notions that man came up with, apart from God having spoken. And again, there are endless possibilities about what God might be like if God doesn't speak. But God has spoken so that we know what He's like. How do I commune with God? How do I commune with God? How do I approach God and know that I'm acceptable to Him? God spoke to the Jews in the Old Testament, and He told them how to approach Him. And I want you to listen to some of the things that God said in the Old Testament about how the Jews could commune with Him. He gave them the covenant of circumcision. And He said that if a man wanted to have a relationship with God, then that was part of his covenant with God, was the practice of circumcision, himself and his sons. He taught them about the priesthood, and He gave them the qualifications for the priest. He gave them the attire of the priest, the responsibilities, how they were to be organized as a group, their conduct among the people of God, how they were to be supported. None of those things, though, everything about the priesthood and about the family of the Levites, what element of that originated in the mind of God? I mean, in the mind of man? It didn't come from Moses. It didn't come from Moses' brother Aaron. Everything that was said about the priesthood all originated with the mind of God. Man didn't guess at that at all. God revealed that. He revealed His will about the priesthood. Animal sacrifices, the type of animal sacrifice, how many they were to offer, what kinds of animals they were to offer, the quality of those sacrifices, when they were to be offered, how a sacrifice was to be done. None of that originated in the heart of man. All of it was something that God spoke about, that He revealed to them so that they would know. Grain offerings, wine offerings, incense, holy water, the lineage of David, the day-to-day behavior of the Jews. All of those were things that God prescribed. All those were things that He taught so that the Jew would know that if I want to draw near to God, here's the path that God has outlined. Here are the boundaries that He's given. And I can have confidence in approaching God because God has told me how to come to Him. God has told me how to commune with Him so that they didn't have to guess about it. They didn't have to innovate. God laid it all out for them. All of those truths gave the people confidence so they would know how to commune with God. Now, when I come to the New Testament, I find a difference. There are some similarities, but there are some differences between how the believers in Christ commune with God and how the Jews commune with God under the Old Covenant. There is a simplicity to the worship of Christians that differs from the worship of Israel, is there not? There's a simplicity about what we've done today compared to what a Jewish worshiper would do when they came to God and worshiped at the temple. Now, how do you explain that difference? Why was it different? Why was it different? The only explanation that I have for why the worship of believers in Christ was different from the worshipers of the Israelites in the Old Testament is because God spoke something different. That it wasn't left to the New Testament Christians to discover it or to figure it out on themselves by themselves. God spoke just the same way that He did through the prophets and through Moses in the Old Covenant, so the people would have confidence for how they would approach Him. And there is a simplicity to what God spoke as a result, in contrast to the ornateness and the complexity of what He delivered to the Jews through Moses. That difference then is only explained by the fact that God expressed Himself differently in the New Covenant, and that the Christians, the believers in Jesus Christ, confine their behavior to the speech of God, to what God said. And so we read, when we look at the New Testament, how believers assembled on Sunday, on the first day of the week, to partake in the Lord's Supper, to remember the death of Jesus Christ. We read in the New Testament how they assembled on Sunday and at other days, in whole, that is, as an entire group, or in part, in order to, in whole or in part, as their. Let me start that sentence again. We read about how they assembled on Sunday and on other days, in whole or in part, as their needs and opportunity to worship, to cry out to God, to serve, to edify, to teach, and evangelize the lost required. I mean, they assembled on Sunday in particular, it seems, to celebrate the Lord's death. But they assembled on that day and at other times as their needs and their opportunity required to do a host of other things that were a part of the mission that God gave them. To worship, to cry out to God for help, to serve, to teach and edify each other, to evangelize the lost. They collaborated in all of those things. They sang hymns, they prayed, they fasted, they combined their monies to care for the needy believers and to support those who shepherded or who ministered the Word. They taught and exhorted and reasoned from the Word. They held one another accountable to imitate God's character and to obey God's teaching and to participate in God's mission. Now that's a very succinct summary of the kinds of things that we find believers doing in the New Testament. Could I speak in particular or just about one act of what believers did when they came together, just to elaborate further the idea that we are bound by what God has spoken? You'll notice in our assembly today that in terms of the music that we offered to God, it was just our voices. That the musical quality of what we sang in terms of praise to God and of what we taught and admonished one another about in song was exclusively a music that we made with our mouths and that we made with our hearts. Now, was that our preference, or is there some greater purpose behind that? Do we have greater freedom to do more than that? I mean, there are lots of ways to make music, right? We can make music with a piano. We can make music with a guitar. There are lots of musical instruments that could add an element of beauty, an element of great importance, of great weight and moment to what it is that we do together when we offer praise to God and when we admonish one another. Could I suggest to you that the reason that we as a group have decided that we not to do that is that we can't find clear evidence in the New Testament where Christians did more than that when they worshiped. We can't find clear evidence that the Christians, when they gathered together in churches in the New Testament, did more than offer God music with their voices. We're clearly commanded to sing praises. We're clearly commanded to sing songs that edify each other. Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, James 5:13, among other passages, speak to that, to God's instructions that we're to praise Him in song and we're to edify one another with spiritual songs. And we find examples of believers doing that very thing. Acts 16 and verse 25, Paul and Silas did that when they were in prison. But when I search the New Testament, I find that God is silent about speaking about more than singing in terms of music and worship. Now, I know that God is not silent about musical accompaniment in the Old Testament. When I go back to the Old Testament, it's clear that people, when they worshiped God, they worshiped Him not just in song, but they worshiped Him with instruments that accompanied their singing. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's not their worship to God in song and with accompaniment was something that was commanded by God. If you worship God in the temple, musical accompaniment was a part of temple worship by God's direction. And so that was not something that originated in the heart of David or in the heart of the prophets or in the heart of the priesthood. The reason they worshiped Him, not only in song but with instrument, is because God commanded them, He instructed them to do that. It was prescribed by God. I don't find that kind of prescription in the New Testament the way that I do there. And what's true about the difference in worship and song is true in general about the difference between all elements of worship in the Old Testament versus the New Testament. They worshiped with incense. They worshiped at a temple, and they were told how to build that temple, what it was to look like. They had certain holy days, the Sabbath day and the new moons and feast days that they were commanded to offer certain sacrifices. They had a priesthood. They had all kinds of other things that are noticeably absent when we look at New Testament worship, the worship of Christians that we read about in the book of Acts and in the letters that Paul and the other apostles wrote. Now the only explanation that I have for what was present there and what is absent in the New Testament is the fact that God spoke those things to them and that God spoke these things to us and that we're all bound by what He spoke. Sometimes that difference between the Old Covenant and the New Testament is explained. For instance, I understand why we don't have a priesthood, why there are no Levites among us. Because the New Testament explains that. It explains that Jesus is our high priest now. And that the whole point of the high priesthood then was to prepare us for His superior priesthood. And that there is no priestly tribe among us, but we are all in Christ made to be priests. And so the reason there's no particular priest among us is because God has ordained all of us to be priests. I understand why there's no temple. We are the temple. The temple is not a building. The temple is a people. And so God has made us His temple in the new covenant. We don't offer animal sacrifices because Jesus is our sacrifice. We don't. What can an animal sacrifice do that Jesus has not already done? And so the absence of those elements in our worship is explained in the New Testament. I don't find that kind of explanation for why God doesn't say something about instruments of worship in the New Testament like He does about those. I have no explanation for that. The only thing that I could say is that simplicity harmonizes with the overall simplicity of the worship that's described in the New Testament. But I can't say anything more than that because I don't know. God didn't say. And so I can't explain that. I can't explain that for Him. Fundamentally then, it's the silence of God that prohibits me from offering something more than the specific music that God has called me to offer, which is to worship Him and to admonish you in song. Now I know that I might want to say, well, I just don't think it matters to God. I can't say that because I don't know whether it matters to God or not. I assume that if it mattered to Him, if He wanted it, that He would have asked for it. And so if He didn't ask for it, I assume that He doesn't want it, that there's a reason why He's expressed Himself with such simplicity in the New Testament. And if I could go back to what I said earlier about filling in the blanks for God and about finishing God's sentences and about not knowing what you're thinking because I can't read your mind, there's a presumption in me saying when God has not said I don't care about that, it's presumptive for me to say I don't think God cares about that when God hasn't told me that. Does that make sense? There's an arrogance that's a part of that I need to be careful about. I need to be bound by what God has said. I understand as well that our practice, like what we do as a group here, what we do as a group of believers, is a judgment just by our abstinence. It's a judgment about what is the predominant practice of many believers around us. It's peculiar. It's weird. Not to have something more in the way of what we worship God with music. It looks legalistic to be so restrictive. But the fact is that our weirdness and our peculiarity is not restricted to that. I mean, there is lots of innovation in worship, is there not? And so there are lots of things that are practiced in worship that you can't find in the New Testament some kind of description of. And so a group might desire to worship God with incense. Or they might have a priesthood and have vestments that the priest wear. There might be the erection of ornate temples. And there might be various icons that have symbolic meanings. And there might be There might be holy water that we sprinkle, that we argue cleanses things. I mean, there can be so many things that are done and that are offered in the way of worship, and that are practiced beyond just the matter of music, that all fall into the same realm. God hasn't spoken about them. And so the abstinence from worship, that's not the only judgment. I mean, the abstinence from all of those things is also a judgment against those practices. Now, when I say that, I don't mean by that to indict anyone's motive. I don't presume that when people offer other things to God, that means that they have a wicked heart, they don't care anything about God. I read even when Paul in Acts chapter 17 spoke to pagan people. I mean, they were worshiping idols. But Paul didn't impute their motives. He says, I presume, it looks to me like you all are very, very religious because you have all these idols and you have all these gods that you bow down to. And you even have, over here, you even have an altar to an unknown God, just in case you left someone out. You don't want to offend him. But Paul goes on to say that they were doing those things in ignorance. And he wanted to shed light in that area of ignorance so they could know what the truth was. And even in saying that, I don't mean to put anyone down. Just to underline the importance of the fact that we have to wait for God to speak. I don't know what God thinks. I don't know what God wants unless God talks to me, unless He speaks to me. How God will judge man's innovation in worship is God's business. I'm content to leave that to God. But at the same time, I can encourage and I can endorse others to do what God didn't command. The only thing that I can encourage you in and endorse in our doing are the things that God has spoken about. And if we are not bound as a people to what God has spoken, then there are no boundaries. Does that make sense? If we're not bound to what God has spoken, then there are no boundaries. I mean, if God has not spoken, as far as I can tell in the New Testament, God has not spoken about offering to Him worship and song that is accompanied by music. Well, if we decide as a group, well, that's not a boundary. We can do that if we want to. Then where are the boundaries? There aren't any. Why not offer Him incense? Why not ordain a priesthood here? Why not get a pretty vestment for me to wear when I speak? Why not have other offices within the church that we think would be practical here? Why not any good idea that we think would be something that would be a great thing? I mean, why not go all out in terms of innovation? Because there are if we're not bound to what God, if we're not restricted by what God has said, then there are no boundaries. We can do whatever we want to do with confidence. But if we take that step, if we say there are no boundaries, then I don't know how we stay together. Does that make sense? Because you may have an idea and I have a different idea, and my idea is better than yours. It's going to be every time. I mean, every time my idea is going to be better than yours. And so that is going to make, and so, we can line up and say, okay, everyone who wants to do my idea, come with me. And then you say, everyone who wants to do my idea, you go with them. And does that not possibly, I just want us to think, does that not possibly explain how it is that the kingdom of Christ is so divided? Is it possible that the reason why the people of God have splintered and have fractured so much through the years, and this may not be the whole reason, but could it not be part of the reason, is because we've seen that we thought that we have the right to intrude into areas where God has not spoken and say, I want to do this. I want to do this. Rather than being a people who say, let's just do Let's just do what God has said. Sometimes we have enough trouble figuring out what God has said, don't we? I mean, sometimes we have to wrestle with the things that God has spoken. Now, if we have trouble with wrestling with the things that God has said, how much trouble are we going to have wrestling over the things that God has not said? It's going to be an impossible task. The only way I know for us to be together, to stay together, is to practice what Paul teaches us, I think, here in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And that's for us to be united by the wisdom that God has spoken. Wisdom we don't have to guess about. A wisdom that God has spoken to us. And what's true of our worship is true of our leadership. That's the reason why, as we're looking for an eldership, we're looking at 1 Timothy 3, we're looking at Titus 1. What Paul wrote about the qualifications of elders, we don't invent what we want leadership to look like. God has told us what leadership ought to look like. It's true of our mission, the work that we do together. It's true of how we accomplish that mission. It's true of the roles of men and women in the home and in the assembly and in terms of what we do together as a people. It's true of our walk as children of God. We don't say what that looks like. God tells us what it looks like. And so we confine ourselves to the wisdom that He's expressed. Now, I know I might have said some things today that maybe blow your mind. I mean, you had never heard that before. And listen, you are obliged to test everything that I say and whether it's true or not. And if it ain't true, then don't accept it. But if it is true, then embrace it wholly. But if it's not true and you don't accept it, come show me. Come help me. Come show me about. Listen, I've been wrong about stuff, and if I'm missing this, if I've misapplied 1 Corinthians 2, help me understand the right application of it. Just like I want to help you understand that. And let's work on it together. None of these are things that we can't discuss and that we can't work on understanding in a better way. And so let's have hearts that want to do that, so that we can arrive at the wisdom of God, nothing more and nothing less than the wisdom of what God has spoken. If you're subject to God's invitation today to become a child of God, to become a follower of Jesus, then won't you come as together we stand and as we sing.